In any case, Kazalix hadn't remained here just so that he could watch the show and reminisce about the past. For a long time now, he had been collecting powerful slaves to aid his cause in becoming the ruler of the entire sea world, and Biliboo was only one of those people. His plan for them was simple, but when others heard about it, they always seemed to think he was either joking or insane. Well, not exactly insane, people here didn't quite know what that was yet, but they definitely thought there was something wrong with his intelligence. He didn't blame them, after all, those young things had little knowledge of what true power looked like. When he told them he was planning to raise Kaisers as slaves, he was never surprised each time they reacted the same way. Laughing in his face as if he was some kind of joke. Well, whatever. They were either dead now or part of the project. Nobody was laughing anymore. He had come over here because he was interested in what could make his subordinates so rowdy. It wasn't every day that you heard that a sea emperor was moving out with his entire army. He had his own guesses on the matter, but on a whim he had decided to see what was going on in person instead of asking telepathically using their bond. His smooth cultivation had put him in a good mood. It was certainly interesting to hear that all of this had been to merely kill one person who was only just reaching the fourth realm, but it was a very, very pleasant surprise to see that the target was the famed Zuko and that he was undergoing evolution. When Zuko had merely been known as the strongest sea king in this area of the sea, it had caught his attention, but it hadn't been enough to move him. After all, until he was the undisputed strongest life form in the sea, it was better to do things undercover, and for that purpose he had been avoiding entering the public eye unless it was too interesting to miss out on or very necessary. Going out to hunt Zuko would certainly catch attention, and unlike if a big event was to happen in his own territory, doing something here would be seen by many people. Moreover, he had never seen the centipede for himself before, so he hadn't put a lot of weight on what these weaklings called the strongest, but now he couldn't help but think that he had been too arrogant. The laws of the moon. Who could have seen it? This Zuko. I must have him. Kazalix's eyes shone brightly as he began to employ one of his favorite techniques. The very technique that had turned Biliboo and others like him into his eternal slaves. It had a few requirements, with one of them being that they shouldn't be in a state where they could resist much, but he would be having zero problem with that. Zuko was already badly damaged, others might be blinded by the ambient energy, but he had had centuries to hone his spirit sense. He could see just how ravaged Zuko was, even if he was quickly healing, but that would not be meaning anything in front of him. But just for insurance, he also launched a powerful soul attack on the side. Just as Zuko had been thinking of making every life form in the sea sing praises to the moon, he noticed a flash in the distance that caught his attention. However, before he could even react, something slammed into his head that instantly gave him a horrifying headache. What? Zuko was shocked and blind. His spirit sense immediately retreated as he lost control of it, and he was too dizzy to take in what he was seeing with his eyes. This, pain. Just like the tribulation? How? Zuko's confidence cracked when confronted by the familiar pain that had almost ruined him. Although the difference in potency was almost as distinct as day and night, it was more than enough to spook him. All of a sudden, a sense of doom gripped him and his instincts went haywire, warning him of imminent fatal danger. He wanted to flee, but once again, he was assaulted by that terrible pain, rendering him helpless. Equals truly impressive. You managed to take 2 of my attacks? There were none like you in the past, and you can be proud of that when you join my side. But your resistance ends here. Good night. A dark voice spoke into Zuko's mind. No. He could tell that something was disastrously wrong and he tried his best to resist, to do anything. But once again, he felt the same attack and he couldn't take it anymore, he passed out. Even his soul is talented, Kazalix thought. The attack he had used had instantly knocked out every of his targets beforehand, but now he had actually had to use it 3 times for success. Truthfully, he should be excited, but now he couldn't help but think that something was wrong. Zuko was too talented, and for no apparent reason. Everybody knew that he had seemingly appeared out of nowhere, so that either meant that he wasn't impressive enough to draw attention in his younger days, or that he had been hiding. In another world he would assume that it might have been because he had found a precious treasure and had been digesting it and hiding for the majority of his early life, but that couldn't be the case because a treasure that could make someone this talented is not something that could be eaten safely, you needed assistance from someone stronger. But obviously that couldn't have happened to Zuko, because no one here was that generous, unless that person wasn't from here. Could Zuko be a test subject? Or a powerful figure's pet? Kazalix wondered. This was what was raising his alarm bells. Although the notion was extremely far-fetched, it was not impossible. If Zuko had some kind of backer of any kind, then he might be in trouble, because anyone who could help someone comprehend the laws of the moon was not someone he wanted anything to do with. But could someone like that even exist here? TCH, my knowledge about the surface is too low. Although he had many ears all over the sea, the surface was a domain he wasn't too familiar with. He didn't know much of what was going on there. For a moment he thought about just being safe, leaving Zuko behind and being certain in the fact that he had everything under control. But then he thought again and laughed. I'm being too paranoid. There's no way I'm letting this go. Greed surged within him and he began using his soul enslavement technique on Zuko. With him, I won't need a mere billaboo. I can dash. Suddenly, the ever-present sound of the rushing ocean vanished. The motion stopped. Zuko, Billaboo, and the countless corpses that were sinking froze. All color faded. This. Kazalix knew what was going on immediately. He had been a victim of it once before and would never forget that day even if 1,000,000 years went by. Huh. A sigh that could be heard across the entire world sounded, and just like that, Kazalix's mind was a brink away from collapse. His memories of what happened after that were shattered and disorderly, but he was pretty sure that the entire world had disappeared, leaving him in empty space. Stars littered the vast darkness like glitter on a dark all-encompassing veil, and it was an imposing sight to witness when all alone, surrounded by essentially nothing. However, that would soon turn out to be false. Because he was not alone. When he turned around, or at least that's what he thought he didn't really remember how it occurred, but regardless, he had no longer been alone. Instead, he was suddenly in the presence of what his broken memories told him was a planet-sized golden eye. The eye had just looked at him, but he felt like he had been stripped bare. His identity, his knowledge, his everything. Nothing was hidden before that entity. He knew he was finished. After an indiscernible amount of time passed, perhaps eons or mere seconds, the entity decided to speak. But for all intents and purposes it might as well have been an ancient curse, because his mind had promptly shut down. His next memory was the eye again, and his mind was much clearer this time. But not a single thought passed through his mind, he didn't quite have that capacity. Some would say what he had felt was fear, or even primordial fear, but he would disagree. Those words could not properly describe the potent something that he had felt. In any case, all he did was stare at the eye, not daring to move a physical or mental muscle. It wasn't even his decision to behave that way. He just simply could not summon the will to do anything. The eye spoke again, and this time he could understand without passing out. It must have decided to weaken its power for his sake. I am Iridius. The entity spoke with it couldn't be called a voice. Not with that kind of sound. However, the sound rumbled throughout the universe and caused many stars to blink out of existence. It certainly wasn't a language he had heard before, but he somehow understood. Apparently, this being was addressing itself as this world's own name. At least, according to the Iridius system. At another time he would have tried to connect the dots, but he didn't. He didn't back then, he didn't now, and he wouldn't in future. He didn't dare. You are greed. The entity spoke again. More stars shattered. At the time, he didn't know what that meant. He was slightly positive that he had never been called greed before, but the entity said it, so it must be true. Even if it wasn't, it was now. The entity said it, and so shall it be. He was greed. Always had been, always will be. I am the lone god, creator of all. You are mortal, one amongst many. Right. Do not disrupt my plans. That didn't seem quite possible, but right. The next time you draw my attention, you will have never existed. Do you understand? No. But right. Go. Sleep for a few years to restore your mind. When you wake, you will be a new being. At that point, no more stars existed. There was only him and the lone god, surrounded by endless darkness. The only source of light was the light of the lone god's eye, and what a sight it made. But then in the next instant he was back in the sea, not quite where he had been last, but instead deep inside a cave he had never seen before. Now, as he pondered on what had just occurred, he couldn't help but think that something serious, very serious had happened to him. But he still couldn't muster the will to do anything. He could now think about what had just happened, and make thoughts, but he just wanted to sleep. His eyes drooped as he stared emotionlessly at the stone wall before him, not moving a single muscle apart from his eyelids. Soon, he slept. When he woke, he would be a new being. He would be Greed. Well, that was something. Eridel thought. He was currently in his more raw state. No avatar, no condensed spirit sense, just him in his planetary form. And he was taking some rare time to reflect on his actions. He had to admit that he had come a long way from his previous self. Who would have thought that he would reach a state where he could so convincingly act like a god? And not just a divine being with divine cultivation, but the kind that most mortals would call a one true god. The creator of all existence. It felt odd. He had come from humble beginnings. Yes, he was rich, and yes, he was a great inventor with a lot of influence, but he had been a mere mortal without the slightest idea of cultivation and the bigger universe. But look at him now. From the lowest form of mortal and enlightened could be, to a bona fide world that could extinguish the will of a fourth realm ex-nightmare with a single word infused with the power of his soul. All this because he was lucky enough to be the target of the golden orb on that fateful day. This kind of thing was probably enough to summon a rainbow tribulation, and yet all he had had to deal with was a red one. It was too abnormal. The only thing that made the most sense was that somehow the golden orb also had the power to hide from fate. But he was incapable of confirming. He had gained strength now, but it wasn't nearly enough. It wasn't enough to reach the pinnacle of power. It wasn't enough to truly be what he had displayed to Khazalix. What he had done to Khazalix and what Khazalix had seen were two completely different things. Obviously. It would be a horrible joke if he actually blew up his own body just to replace himself with an eye. And there was no way he could destroy a star with just his voice, talk less of all of them. It had all been an illusion. In reality, he had dragged out Khazalix's soul into his own mindscape where he would be completely exposed. From there, it was just a few visual tricks and infusing his words and presence with his powerful, eternally upgrading soul cultivation. The intent had been to greatly rattle Khazalix's soul and scare him. Him becoming an eye was just the inner boy in him, putting up theatrics. He expected the fear and submission, even the damaged soul. But what he didn't expect was for Khazalix's will flame to blow out like a candle. Even with all of the knowledge granted to him by the golden orb, the information he had regarding will flames was low. However, even a fool with a rotting brain would be able to recognize that it would be very bad if a will flame died out. But bad was putting it mildly. In reality, it was a step or two away from fatal. Thankfully, the information regarding will flames wasn't completely lacking and he knew a few things. First of all, a will flame was exactly what it sounded like. It was the embodiment of someone's will and could be considered the engine of their soul. For those who were adept in the soul, they would be able to see it at the center of their mindscape. Drive, diligence, motivation, and things like that were heavily tied to the quality of a will flame. The higher the quality and the more vigorous it burned, the more passion you felt to do things on a daily basis. And by contrast, the dimmer the flame, the lazier and more susceptible to things like depression you were. However, as was mentioned before, all things had grades. Perhaps they weren't all distinctive enough to be named, but there were always worser and better versions. When it came to will flames, they were divided into grades called tiers, and Eridel knew about 3 of them. His own will flame was at tier 2, and it was golden color. It happened after he had pushed himself to the limit to survive his red tribulation. He didn't know how it worked since he didn't possess the knowledge to cultivate it in the first place, but he could only guess that his strong will to overcome everything in that moment caused some changes to his will flame that pushed it to the next tier. In tier 1, a will flame was very susceptible to changes and could be affected by the things that happened to its owner, becoming brighter or dimmer depending on what state of mind the owner was in. But when a will flame reached the second tier, it would etch within itself the most predominant personality traits of the owner and would stick to them. From then on, it would be exceedingly difficult for the owner to have a drastic change in personality. This was a good thing for most and a bad thing for some. As for Eridel, he knew his will flame traits were the following: wrathful, lustful, prideful, ruthless, domineering, noble, fearless, defiant, ambitious, creative and peerless. A good amount of them hadn't shown themselves in a while, especially the first 2. After all, there wasn't much that could make him angry apart from when his worldly instincts were pushing him to do something stupid. But what would he do about that? Punch himself? He wasn't interested in having sex with the women in his world either. A small part of it was they were his creations, and he could read their every thought, which put a damper on things, but the biggest reason was their severe lack of knowledge. They were effectively all cave women with no concept of hygiene and basic necessities. He may be lustful, but not that lustful. The last trait had slightly surprised him. What did it even mean to have a peerless personality trait? But it didn't take him more than a few nanoseconds to come to the conclusion. Pretty much from the time he was born till now, he had effectively had no peers. He had never experienced the feeling of having a rival, he had never experienced the feeling of having to rely on someone, and he had never looked up to a single living life form. Nobody was on his level. The world looked at him and found themselves wanting, but it had never been the other way round. He had respected people and he had been kind to many, but that had mainly been because of the way he had been raised. Apparently, that ended up culminating in his noble trait. But he had never really looked at someone and felt they were someone like him. Never felt the man-to-man confrontation. And now that he was a world that could think like both a human and a supercomputer, this had only become more prominent. As far as he knew, the only entity that resembled him now was his first soulmate, the pink gas planet. But that had been because of his own doing. It might have been a surprise, but it was still a result of his actions. He was peerless. Perhaps that was why he had barely stepped down onto his lands to walk amongst his people. In fact, the amount of people that had seen his avatar could be counted with a hand and a few fingers, despite the great amounts of opportunity. And even then, he never stayed long. He seemed to spend more time lying around on clouds, eating various foods that he created, than actually showing his face anywhere. How amusing. How very amusing. Thankfully he didn't see something like aloof on his trait list, or he would have mocked himself for being a frigid loner. As it stood, he could only wait until his world was more interesting before deciding to actually step down and smell the roses. Maybe when toilets and bathrooms were invented? Haha. In any case, flames were pretty unique. Tier 1 was what pretty much everyone else had and didn't need to be mentioned. Tier 2 encoded your most predominant personality traits and allowed you to keep your mentality no matter how much time passed or what you experienced. But it's not like you couldn't feel anything else, those were just the core personality traits. And Tier 3. That's where things really got juicy. Alas, it was pointless to think about considering how far out of his reach it was. Instead, he was much more interested in what would happen to Kazalix. Kazalix had a Tier 1 wolf flame that was gray in color, nothing special about that. But it had been blown out like a candle flame. According to his knowledge, there were a few things that could stimulate back into existence, and he had done those things, but there was no way to confirm success or failure since a long time of rest was still needed. He would just have to see if the guy would ever wake up. Funnily enough, this turn of events had set back his plans, but it wasn't too big of a deal. For a few years now, he had been aware of Kazalix's existence. Ever since his wolf flame had progressed to Tier 2 and given him the ability to slightly ignore his planetary instincts, he had decided that there had to be a limit to letting things progress by themselves, and he needed to be more alert. One of the things he had done in regards to that was to give a few buzzwords to the Eridel system that would alert him whenever someone spoke or even thought about them. Abyss was one of those words. He didn't think that another reincarnator would appear, but it wasn't like Gaia was expected either. He would be a fool to not be on the lookout. Lo and behold, not even a day later, he had found out about Kazalix's true identity. Abyss wasn't even the word that alerted him, it was the more obvious, past life that did it. And it wasn't just Kazalix either. There were a few other reincarnators too, and finding that out was like lifting up a brick and finding all kinds of bugs hiding underneath. As a world, foreign invaders were disgusting. One could look at a single insect and marvel, but looking at a collection of them was abhorrent. He himself didn't actually have anything against the reincarnators, but the repulsed feeling was still there. No doubt a result of his planetary instincts. He had already directly killed one of them, and of course, not without taking all of her memories. She had possessed devious plans for world dominance and actually had the capability to achieve it too, thus, she died. There was no conversation, no heavenly light, no altercation. Just one day she was living her life as a Realm 3 unicorn and the next moment she died with no injury. The only reason he left a body behind was because it was useful for whichever beast found and ate it. That just so happened to be Lily the White Snake, the one with the malevolent enchantress bloodline that was created alongside Yorma and Draco. For someone like Lily, who specialized in charm and illusions, to find that specific corpse of all corpses. If he had been using an avatar at the time, his jaw would have dropped. This kind of luck was not normal, so of course he decided to check her out a bit. And since one of the best ways to find out if someone was destined for greatness was to check out the prospects of their soulmate, that was exactly what he did. He must admit, the result had stunned him for a good few whole seconds. Okay, more like 2.657523941108, but that was still a lot when it came to him. He certainly did not expect her to be the soulmate of the blood tree anomaly on the South Continent. They didn't seem anything alike. However, who knew what would happen in the future? Sometimes gigantic changes could occur in an instant. Just look at Kazalix. One encounter with him and the ex-nightmare had become the greatest candidate for the sin of greed. Another of his experiments, naturally. Unfortunately, the same event had nearly crippled the octopus, which was what had set back his plans. Although Eridel didn't have control over the souls of reincarnators the same way he had control of the souls he himself had created, there were still a lot of things he could do. Affecting emotions was by far one of the easiest things. From the time he had learned about Kazalix and the others, they had all been implemented into various plans, and Kazalix becoming the host of greed was one of them. He wasn't just going to let these cockroach-like reincarnators just appear in his world without a great price. They were all going to work for their stay or end up like the unicorn. What had happened to Kazalix was a pity, but it is what it is. The original plan was to do things much more safely and over a larger course of time, but there was no way he could ignore what Kazalix had been about to do to Zuko. Such a thing would only cause big issues and no benefits. Of course, it wasn't his first thought to just drag out Kazalix's soul. Before all of that, he had been giving suggestions and insights to Kazalix's mind, which was what had made him suspicious of a possibly big backer, almost making him give up on Zuko. But in the end, it wasn't enough. There had been a 29% chance of success, and he hadn't been lucky. At the very least, since he had taken Kazalix's soul, he did not miss out on the chance to take all of his memories. And in the end, he had even obtained relevant information that he found vital to his future needs. But speaking of Zuko, that fool had really and truly almost fallen into doom after all of that fanfare. Up till now, with all the close deaths and ridiculous luck, Zuko's entire life had resembled that of some sort of protagonist more than anyone else on this planet. You'd think that with the way he had been acting after narrowly surviving again, only to enter the fourth realm and evolve, he would have swept away all of his enemies just like every other cartoon or movie main character that received an upgrade after dying. Sadly for Zuko, this was the real world. Fate always struck out at the most despicable moment, and the centipede had almost tasted it. Fortunately for Zuko, he had been saved once again, and this time by Eridel himself. Unfortunately for Zuko, the keyword there was fortune. The centipede was undoubtedly going to be paying a big price once again. There are no protagonists here in Iridius, only mortals. And all must pay a price. In any case, although there were some bumps, things were still progressing smoothly. There was just a strange case of certain things happening sooner than planned and other things being delayed. He could now take some attention off of the sea and focus on other matters, namely, the subjugation of the sin of envy. And after that he would be releasing a massive update to the Iridius system that would kickstart a lot of things. He couldn't wait. 6 years later. Year 178. 6 years had passed since the first grand meeting held on the Central Continent, a game-changing event that had led to many changes, with one of them being the new official name of their continent. This had been a great topic of discussion, but ultimately they had all agreed to go with the name that Gaia, their resident goddess, had chosen. And that had been Fortissimum. Apparently the word meant the strongest, which appealed to many of those that had the right to make decisions in the meeting, and they could vaguely understand that too even without Gaia's explanation. But they were confused by the fact that the word hadn't been directly translated. Why could they still hear Fortissimum instead of the strongest? It wasn't until a few individuals who had already possessed language even before the introduction of the system, like the Elf Queen and their Elven language, pointed out that they had noticed that if you use a word as a title, it would not get directly translated and would retain its pronunciation, that they started to get the gist of what was going on. They asked the system and it confirmed their suspicions. If a word from a foreign language was used as a title, it would keep its original pronunciation and only the meaning would go across to those that heard it. Someone asked why it had taken so long to figure that out, and they eventually came to the realization that it was because they had all assumed that every word they heard was a part of the common language, and it had never in their mind to doubt it. They heard a word, they got the meaning, so what could be wrong? Moreover, it was rare for people to still use their previous rudimentary languages if they even had one, and had never been a big deal. In any case, they had discovered another feature of the Iridius system and they had been pleased. They promptly agreed to Gaia's decision, and as such, the central continent was now known as the Fortissimum continent, aka the strongest continent. Everyone had felt a sense of excitement at that, feeling it in their blood that they were bound for great things. And with their great mission to put an end to envy, it was inevitable that they felt a unique feeling of glory that they could not dampen. And why should they? They were the strongest. Of course, that didn't mean that they were fools. And the three outsiders that had come to warn them of envy in the first place did not hesitate to tell them to calm down and be extremely cautious of envy. They had first-hand experience of the menace that was the despicable brother, and he had been a problem even before he had become envy. Now, he wasn't just a super strong being, but he was also a multi-continental lord and a first-class calamity. He was absolutely not to be underestimated. The denizens of the Fortissimum continent took the advice, mostly. With their own goddess on their side and the knowledge that they were about to ally with their greatest rivals whom they had been sharing the continent with since they had been born, they were feeling pretty great about their odds. Sure, envy had conquered an entire continent with his own forces, but their continent was not like any other, and they believed that with all their heart. Moreover, they were going to be allying with other continents, so it wasn't like they were going to be low on numbers, and with the confidence Gaia had shown, it was safe to say that her trump card had a good chance of working. Still, they made many preparations to nullify the influence of envy if he ever tried to extend his reach to Fortissimum, because that was still a threat. Alas! Nothing could have prepared them for the utter atrocities that began to take place in the following years. It was utter madness. Children attacking their parents to usurp their position, people kidnapping and or *ping the target of their desires, people constantly stealing from others as if they would die if they stopped, beasts killing and eating others' beasts in the hopes of stealing their talent. Every possible act that could be caused by the emotion called envy was caused. This was a gigantic shock to many. They had thought that they had already culled most of the people that had been afflicted by envy. But seemingly out of nowhere they had started springing up like plants in a sacred land, and it wasn't just in the Fortissimum continent either. A few individuals had been given the task of traveling to close-by giant bodies of land to gather allies, but many of them had encountered lands filled with envy's creatures, and a few of them never came back. It was too scary. But that wasn't even the worst of it. Not only was there an outbreak of envy plagues like the one that Zaliacard had caused in the Elven Kingdom, Titania had volunteered to provide information on the experience, but there were also a few fourth realmers who had suddenly struck out at the worst moment, causing disastrous losses and revealing themselves as slaves of envy. A few alliances had even turned into enmity because of that. It was probably safe to say that envy was very aware of their intentions to take him down. And that was never a good thing. Nevertheless, they powered through the dangers and made many important alliances, with their most important ones being the followers of Moon. It had been a surprise to learn more and more about the Moon's existence, and it had been a great joy to learn that they were gaining a newly appointed Kaiser along with his entire forces as allies. It had already made traveling easier, especially between the Fortissimum continent and Chad's continent, and would probably be crucial during the war they had every intention of initiating at this moment. They were tired of living with the tension that envy's influence had caused. A lot of friendships had frayed because of the way the last 6 years had gone. There had been many cases of betrayal, and it was no longer wise to trust people as much as before. Especially if you were in a position that people envied. It created a very dark mood, and so long as envy lived, things would only become worse and never better. As such, if before the desire to take out envy had been precaution and fear for the future, now it had become personal for everyone, and they all wanted him dead. In all of Iridius, envy was by far the most hated living being alive. And many had problems with that last word. Soaring through the sky above a beach on the Fortissimum continent was what appeared to be a horse. Except this horse had a pair of wings on its back, a single spiraling horn on the forehead, and a long thin lion-like tail that ended in a similarly designed spiraling spike. It had pure white fur, but the horn, tail spike, eyes, and mane were all a cerulean blue. This was a creature with clear affinity with water, but more importantly, this creature was clearly a unicorn. A highly unique but small in number species that came into power a few decades ago when their progenitor had been alive. Not much was known about her, but there were all sorts of rumors that surrounded her existence. Unfortunately, before people could decide what to do about her, they had been met with the abnormal news that she had been found dead. It wasn't abnormal that she died, no, that was common news. What was abnormal was that nobody knew how. The unicorn progenitor had been a fourth realm life form, and beings with this strength didn't just die quietly. It would take a fight with another fourth realmer or a lot of third realmers, and such a commotion would always drag attention. Every single time. One might argue that the event of whatever led to her death had taken place in a very obscure location, but what everyone found baffling was that she had died in her own territory, in her own home. Nobody knew how. There were guesses of things like extremely harmful foods and even suicide, but nobody could confirm, and only Lily, the sister of Yorma and the one who had found the corpse, had knowledge of what state the corpse was in. Nobody dared to press her for answers. In any case, although the rise of the unicorn race had been put to an early end, they were still a respected race that were valued by many. Bellatrix was the eldest daughter of the unicorn progenitor, and she had very recently reached the fourth realm. She had long ago migrated her race to the Origin Forest and was now aligned with the true dragons. It was more of a master and subordinate relationship. Actually, her initial plan had been to take the unicorns to the Dawn Forest to seek the protection of the glacial Saint Deer clan and make use of her lucky friendship with the Queen of Elves, but Gaia, the legendary goddess, had appeared before her with an offer she couldn't refuse. So here she was, working for Gaia and by extension the true dragon race, and she had just arrived back on the Fortissimum continent after completing her most recent mission. However, she would not be returning with good news. Her mission had been to visit the recently discovered major continent, to scout them out and seek an alliance if possible. A major continent was what everybody had decided to address the continents that could match the Fortissimum, and only 2 others had been found so far. These were of course, the one that Chad was from, and the one that Envy currently resided in. The former was very impressive and she had been there 2 times before, but the latter? She didn't dare to go there at all. Most of the scouters like her that had gone to that continent had never returned. Only 2 had made it back and one of them had died not long after. This new 4th major continent was found a few months ago, and as one could expect, the discovery had raised many waves. However, as excited or wary as everyone was, they couldn't afford to make mistakes. So a plan had been formed and the mission had landed in her lap. This wasn't because of her speed, although she had a lot of that, and not even because of her affinity with water that made the dangers of falling into the sea a moot point. Instead, it was because of her charm intent, an intent that all unicorns were born with. Naturally, this was all inherited from their progenitor, but none of them could utilize charm the way their progenitor could. Most of them couldn't even do anything with it and could only be more charming than the average person, and only Bellatrix herself had managed to create a charm technique that a few talents of her race had managed to learn later on. But they couldn't complain. Everybody knew how hard it was to grasp an intent, so the unicorn race could be considered lucky to be born with one for free. Asking to be given innate charm skills on top of that would be asking for too much. Nevertheless, it was because of this that Bellatrix had been chosen. The technique that she made could barely classify as one, but it still allowed her to imitate an enhancement innate skill. She called it charm flare, and it heightened her charm by many degrees. As one could guess, this was very useful when trying to create alliances. Unfortunately, she had failed. 2 months ago, she had left Fortissimum for the newly discovered major continent, and what she had discovered had left her astonished. Firstly, the territories of the continent had been divided into 2, with their overall rulers being 2 different races. This was already mind-boggling. Not even Gaia and the true dragons, or Yorma and her snake race, had accomplished such an expansive domination. But what was even more shocking was the identity of the races that owned these great territories. These 2 races were the kind she would have previously considered the lowest of the low. Pitiful races that had 0 power to speak of. And often enough times, members of those races would literally have 0 power. Not even first realm strength. And yet, on one side of the continent, everything was ruled by a colony of ants. And on the other, everything was ruled by the famed and popular servant race, the humans. Announcement. Last one for a while, I think. All good things must come to an end. The game's open test has reached its end, and the tournament that I spoke about has also concluded. Playlist link for the tournament, https://youtube.com/playlist?list $?4B1U5F00WGMGABKLG69LWHDJGME&SI=YXB5ETDGen2EYHNT. Try not to faint after hearing this king's voice. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe, smiley face. Anyways, as you'll probably see, the game is in need of a lot of content and some bug fixes, so I'll be working on that for some time. Eventually, another open test will arrive, and at that time, the barrier stopping everyone from reaching the 4th realm will be removed. Some people might be asking if there will be tribulations, and the answer to that is yes. For most of you, that won't be much of a problem, but for some of you? Well, I can only say that you brought it upon yourself. Don't blame fate for being vicious. I can only promise you that if you survive, your benefits will be greater, but if you don't, haha. Let it be repeated again. On one side of a major continent, everything was ruled by ants. And the other side was ruled by humans. Humans and ants. Humans and ants. Utterly nonsensical. When she had arrived on the continent, she had arrived on the territory controlled by ants. She hadn't known it then because it wasn't like the ants were crawling over every stretch of land, but she had eventually stumbled upon a nest and she had been highly impressed. That colony of ants had possessed a queen in the 3rd realm and it had greatly surprised her. No other ant had risen to that kind of height. In fact, in the entire insect world, only a few races could go that far, with the most impressive being the moonlit wasps. She even remembered thinking that the colony of ants had the potential to someday rival the moonlit wasps even if they didn't have a great backer like the moon. However, she didn't have any business mingling with insects from a foreign continent. The quicker she finished her job and got out, the better for everyone else, but most importantly herself. Intruding into foreign lands would always be dangerous. Obviously, she didn't know that she was only looking at the tip of the iceberg. Having set out on a mission to find the real decision-makers of the continent, it was inevitable that she would eventually stumble upon the Burning Nines, which wasn't too far away. It was there that she found out that the nest she had found before was merely a branch nest of a super colony that was much bigger than anything she could have possibly imagined. And if the average strength of the ants were anything to go by, that nest was probably the weakest of its kind. The Burning Nines itself was a terrific sight to behold. 9 rings of sky-piercing dark mountains that were covered in lakes of fire and lava, with the biggest one of them all placed in the middle with an ominous presence that could not be put into words. Billowing smoke that completely replaced the sky, an omnipresent smell of sulfur and flesh, a suffocating mantle of heat that could not be escaped, and finally, the countless deadly auras that unveiled the existence of innumerable lethal creatures. For someone with water affinity like her, this was the worst kind of location to be in. In fact, it was precisely the most anathema scene to her existence that she had ever witnessed. It was horrible. Alas, the moment she arrived, she knew that the place was her destination. Nowhere else could compare. So for a few days, she had decided to investigate the place and its inhabitants. And as expected, there were all sorts of creatures with fire, earth, and even lava affinity. The 9th ring, which was essentially the first ring that one would encounter when coming to the Burning Nines, was the weakest. But that was relative, because even Realm 3 creatures could be found there. As one went from one ring to the next, getting closer and closer to the center, the average strength of the creatures within rose, and the resources were correspondingly better. She found ants, and everyone was scared. Shockingly enough, she had actually found an elf in this ring. A weird one, but an elf nonetheless. It was a shock, because although humans could be found in other continents, elves could only be found in Fortissimum. Everyone had chalked it down to the fact that the elves were all descent from the Tree of Life, and there were no other such trees for other groups of elves to come from, so to find another elf here was definitely a great discovery that Titania would like to hear about. The elf was a male child that seemed to be about 18 years old or so. His cultivation hadn't been impressive, only being in the 2nd realm, but his musculature had been impeccable. Prime, sleek muscles that were designed to burst out with power without a sacrifice in flexibility, and a vigor filled with grace that displayed a great amount of experience. The weird thing had been the unnatural darkness of his skin. It was barely dark enough to be called brown and was more like a bronze metal, but she had never seen an elf like that before. They usually had pale skin. Perhaps it had been a result of the heat? Fire usually darkened anything that was exposed to it, and maybe the boy had experienced that. Regardless, an elf was here, and he even seemed to have an affinity with fire, another unprecedented feature for an elf, or maybe it was lava. It was hard to tell sometimes, especially in a place like this. Either way, it was still a feat that no other elf had accomplished. At least that she knew of. Anyways, the boy's situation hadn't been good. In fact, he had been running for his life from a small pack of beasts that she couldn't recognize. They were four-legged creatures with robust forelegs, big elongated mouths filled with sharp fangs, and no eyes. The elven boy's perfectly trained body allowed him to run quite quickly, but the pack of strange creatures were four-legged, and those forelegs of theirs weren't for show. Eventually, they would catch up. What was interesting was that there had been no fear on the elven boy's face. He had looked very frustrated and more than a little angry, but there had been none of the expected fear. Naturally, that had made Bellatrix wonder if he had some sort of trick up his sleeve that would save his life. Still, she didn't decide to wait and see and opted to save his life without hesitating. She had a lot of goodwill towards the elves and wouldn't risk one of their lives for the sake of curiosity, and so with a few stomps she had put an end to the pitiful scene. Being in the fourth realm, her size alone made things quite effortless. She would later make conversation with the boy, but it had been a very odd one. She had first asked him what he was doing in a dangerous place like this, and she had been forced to repeat the question a few times because the boy had been in an understandable state of shock, but when he finally registered the question, for whatever reason he just scoffed before walking away, actually turning his back on her. Obviously she didn't want that to happen, but she wasn't particularly affronted either, so she decided to make one more attempt at conversation. If he ignored her again, she would just leave. "I've seen other elves like you before, in a faraway place filled with colorful trees and beautiful buildings. Ah, not many people know what a building is. I can only tell you that it is a wonderful home that no cave or underground can compare to. I don't know if you have family somewhere else here, but if not, then I can take you to them if you would like. Just after I'm done with my business." That was what she had said, and his response had been odd. He stood shocked for a good minute with his eyes shaking wildly, which was already a bit of an overreaction, but then opened his mouth as if to say something but no sound came out. He closed his mouth, reopened it and even held a hand to his chest as if he was in pain, but still he didn't say anything. For a good while he would repeat the action of opening and closing his mouth, looking like he was choking on something that was clogging his breathing. Honestly, it was quite concerning. But then all of a sudden he snapped his teeth together with a ferocious tack, spun around and stomped away. "Leave me alone, beast," he had viciously roared. Bellatrix could only watch with a bewildered expression. To say that she had been surprised would be putting it too lightly. She hadn't expected such a crazy reaction, and she consoled herself with the very possible thought that the boy might have a few issues that the Elven Kingdom didn't need, when she eventually left to head deeper into the Blazing Nines. She continued to investigate the different rings, striking up conversations whenever she felt necessary by utilizing her charm, spying on unique creatures/resources, and altogether learning about the whole situation. It was during this time that she learned just how much she had underestimated the ants. Not that it was hard to find out, they certainly weren't hiding, and just the sight of even fourth realm life forms like her avoiding a group of third realm ants was heart-stopping to say the least. She would even later witness a third realm ant arrogantly summoning a fourth realm salamander as if the little thing couldn't be crushed by a single bite, and yet the salamander humbly obeyed without fuss. Horrifying. It was after seeing that she thought she might have been too careless with her decision to come so close, the third ring to be specific. She wanted to retreat, especially since she knew that she was drawing attention with her unique appearance, powerful cultivation, and most importantly her water affinity. But she didn't want to quit so easily. Nevertheless, she chose to go on in a far more discreet manner. She was already discreet before, but now she was practically living in the clouds, only coming down occasionally to make inquiries and leaving the Blazing Nines entirely whenever she needed to rest. Alas, it didn't last long before she herself received an unexpected summoning. She had been floating in the clouds, deep in thought, when all of a sudden she noticed a powerful presence steadily approaching her location. The aura belonged to an entity in the fourth realm, and that was not someone who could be ignored. However, she initially kept calm. After all, although it was strange that she had been found, there wasn't much that she was really afraid of. At most, it would be another conversation, and at worst, she would have to fly away. Her charm was very good at diffusing hostility most of the time. Although it could sometimes have the opposite effect if she wasn't careful, she wasn't an inexperienced child anymore. But only a short moment later, her indifference to the approaching entity melted. The being that had been approaching was none other than a blazing ant, and it had wings. That would mean it was either a male drone or a queen. But it couldn't be a drone if it had cultivation that advanced. She had obtained a lot of information concerning the ants and knew about the various castes, especially the more important ones. Apparently, there were only 3 castes of ants that had wings. The first was a queen ant. They were born with wings, but shed them off whenever they got mated and started their own colonies. However, if they entered the 4th realm and gained the rights to be called a supreme queen, they would evolve and regain their wings. But the wings would be incomparable to the former. Not much was known to the general public, but it was said that the wings could absorb mana, could assist in amplifying magical attacks, and could even be used as effective shields. They were called supreme wings. The Empress of the Blazing Ant Colony had been the first to evolve upon entering the 4th realm, gaining her supreme wings and setting a path for all those who shared her blood. However, hers were allegedly different from the supreme wings that her descendants had, and everyone else called them Empress wings. Whether that was out of respect or a real thing could not be known. Nobody dared to fight her and test out her abilities. The second caste of ant that had wings was of course the male drone. Their sole purpose was to mate with a virgin queen during the mating season nuptial flight and start a new colony. Shortly afterwards they died. Apparently they could cultivate like anyone else, and the higher their cultivation the longer they could survive after mating, but their cultivation talent was just too low to take into consideration. On the bright side, they were taken care of because the better their cultivation, the better the resulting hatchlings as well. It would be too cost-effective to nurture all of them to a high cultivation, but a few of them did receive that treatment and they would go on to start powerful named colonies. A named colony is a branch colony that was strong enough or useful enough to be named by the Empress. Finally, the third caste of ant that had wings was the Ant Kings. The rarest caste of the Blazing Ant Super Colony. They had the strongest fighting and cultivation talent below the Empress. They didn't shed their wings and instead got a second pair of wings, the Supreme Wings. At the 4th realm, they were rumored to have terrifying intelligence, and most importantly, they not only had the ability to impregnate females from other races, unlike the ant queens who could only get impregnated by an ant drone or ant king, but the resulting child will always be born as an ant queen with characteristics inherited from the mother. The only downsides to the ant kings was that they were just too rare, with only about 30 plus of them in existence compared to the thousands of queens, and that whether they were impregnating a female from another race or a fellow ant queen, they would only give birth to one female ant queen. An ant queen would not be able to store the semen of an ant king like she could with a drone, so there would only be one birth. Naturally, it was inefficient for the kings to mate with queens since all it did was produce another queen, so it wasn't done a lot and not much was known as a result. But there was all sorts of information and rumors about special branch colonies that had been started by the daughter of a king and a female from a unique and different race. And as the 4th realm flying ant got closer to her, she soon noticed the presence of 2 sets of wings. The hallmark of a supreme ant king. And as far as she was aware, the only one currently in existence. She supposed that that was the moment that her luck began to run dry. As anyone would expect from the oldest and most powerful ant king who had the ability to sire special colonies with special women, she was propositioned to give birth to an ant queen. The ant king had started off nice enough, introducing himself as Io Carrig in a polite manner, explaining his reason for coming and offering her a reward for her service if she desired. He had complimented her on her appearance, praised her strength, and highlighted her talent with wonder, all which had appealed to her ego. And she must be honest, she had been very tempted. Although she had never been attracted to bugs, she was sure that the entire process would be conducted in their enlightened forms, and no matter the race of beast or monster, they were all attracted to the enlightened. And as such, there would no longer be a biological barrier after they both transformed. Furthermore, considering Io Carrig's talent, cultivation, and special race, he was bound to be enthralling when he revealed his other form. There was also the fact that it appealed to her nature to give birth to a talented child. It irked that the result would be an ant and not a unicorn, but the child would still be hers, born from her womb. The fact that she would have to give up her child to be raised in the colony was sad, but she understood that an ant needed to be with the colony to thrive and it wasn't like she would be denied access to her. She had been told that she would be able to visit any time she wanted, given rights to the colony that only the queen mothers had. And most importantly, if she was to go through with it, there was a good chance that she would be able to forge an alliance with the ants using her child, and bring them into the fight against envy. For that reason, although she would be putting an end to her virginity to become a mother for who knows how many months, she had been on board with the idea, with the sole requirement being that she achieve an alliance with them in a fight against envy. That was why she began to speak about envy, explaining everything about him and their plan to put an end to him. Io Carrig had listened calmly, only showing visible reactions when she had told him about some of Envy's feats, but he had never interrupted her. Eventually, she came to a stop, and then the questions began. With each question, Io Carrig seemed to find flaw after flaw in their plan, with the most grating flaw being her lack of knowledge on how they were actually going to destroy envy. She had of course expected that, after all, other people the Fortissimum had sought an alliance with had asked about the same thing. But with all the other flaws being pointed out, she had been left flustered. Really and truly, the intelligence of the Ant Kings was not a joke. Of course she still tried, even using her charm technique to enhance her charm and pleading that the great evil that was envy needed to be destroyed, but then the nail in the coffin had been when the Ant King had stated that 1, the ants were terrible over water and they would not be crossing it even if they were given rides on flying beasts, and 2, they didn't care much about envy in the first place. It turned out that from the beginning, the ants had never been affected by sin of envy. In the entirety of the blazing ant colony, not a single individual was envious. Not even the male drones. When she expressed her disbelief on the matter, Io Carrig had scoffed, revealing a crack in his demeanor even if just for a moment, but he soon calmed down again and simply explained that the entire colony was created to serve. They were born to work. The different castes had different jobs, and they all did their jobs dutifully. How could they be envious if they all had jobs? What other desire was there than servitude to the cause? All for the Empress and the sacred volcano, Io Carrig had said. It had left Bellatrix mind blown, never had she ever seen such profound loyalty and devotion in a race. Well, perhaps the moonlit wasps were similar, but she had never communed with one of them and her knowledge about them was insufficient, so seeing something like this had definitely been a first. But when she came down from the surprise, she had to face the fact that it appeared there was no hope for an alliance with the blazing ant super colony, which had been incredibly disappointing. The disappointment made her decision to deny the mating request if there was no possibility of alliance all the more easier. She didn't care to ask about what the mentioned sacred volcano was, she assumed that it was the giant volcano in the middle that was the primary nest of the colony, and even if it wasn't, there was no more need to care about the blazing ants anymore. She needed to leave and complete her mission. So that's why she thanked Io Carrig for his offer but denied him, mentioning her need to move on and seek more allies. Alas, it was at that moment that things took a turn. She had turned around to seek out her next destination, when all of a sudden she detected a wild change in the aura behind her, but more pointedly the drastic increase in heat. Io Carrig had launched an attack at her. She was barely able to react, but still dodged, but even then, the fire was so hot that even without contact it hand-singed her fur. Appalling. It went without saying that she had been quite furious, and she had swiftly demanded an explanation. She would never forget the response. It is always a pity to harm beautiful creatures such as yourself, but it is for the colony, and for the colony, there is nothing I am unwilling to do. Please return with me before I'm forced to subdue you. The words were spoken cynically and without emotion, and it had left an impact. What took place next was the most horrifying chase she had ever been subjected to. Io Carrig was fast, very fast, and although she was slightly faster than him at max speed, Io Carrig's acceleration, deceleration and overall agility were just too unfair. It had taken her much more time to reach max speed than he did, and in that time she had suffered a few injuries that had managed to breach her defenses. Io Carrig was powerful. He was in the first stage like her, but his magical might surpassed hers greatly. Long-ranged attacks were typically weaker than close-range ones if you didn't charge them, and yet Io Carrig's fire projectiles had managed to cause her notable damage. But although that had been painful, that wasn't what had been so terrifying. No, the real scare had been when all of a sudden, queen ants had begun to fly in her direction with other castes of ants marching below. They had to be virgin queens since the mated queens mostly spent their time giving birth, but it still didn't make sense. The queens had not been weak, with a few of them being in the 4th realm, but how could there be a 4th realm or even 3rd realm queen that wasn't mated? Moreover, she found it inconceivable that they would fly out to attack her without any regard for their lives, when they were usually so protected. In fact, she had never even seen a queen ant before that moment because mated or not, none of the royal castes were something that could be easily sighted. Every ant took their safety very seriously, and they were kept away in very secure locations. So how could they suddenly become so free to see that a bunch of them would fly out to attack her like lackeys? Also, weren't they supposed to have much bigger abdomens? Their primary duty was to lay many eggs a day, and it was said that they looked like it. And yet, the abdomens of these ants hadn't been too different from Iocarig's, although the ones in the fourth realm had seemed more bulkier than him, something that also conflicted with her knowledge about the queens. Were they even queens? They seemed to fit the description of the royal guards more than queens. She didn't know the specific name of their castes, but there were a few rare castes that were dedicated to working for the kings and queens, the empress too obviously. Naturally, as a result of that, there was not much that was known about them, but she had been told that none of them had wings. Only the drones, queens, kings, and empress did. Had that been a lie? Perhaps, but lie or not, whatever those ants were, they were flying and they had all launched attacks at her as soon as they were close enough. They had all been fire attacks because the earth and magma attacks were too slow to be used in such a high-speed chase, and for that she had been lucky. But still, the next few hours had been the second most terrifying moment of her life. Having had to repeatedly dodge attacks, she had been forced to drop her speed again and again, never gaining the chance to reach maximum speed. Inevitably, this kept her in sight of her pursuers, with no chance to ditch them. They didn't even stop when she left the Burning Nines, and it was during this chase that she truly discovered how vast the territory of the blazing ant supercolony was. After all, whenever she passed a branch nest with sufficient strength, they would somehow detect what was going on and join the chase as if they had been lying in ambush the entire time. Thankfully, whatever caste of ant was chasing her wasn't high in number, otherwise things would have been over for her. She could just imagine the scene of being surrounded by thousands of ants that covered the sky, and it was a terrific thought. Speaking of scary thoughts, she hated to think about what would have happened to her if she was a land-bound creature that couldn't fly. One had to use their imagination to conjure the sight of thousands of ants covering the sky, but that had been the actual reality on the ground below. Hundreds of thousands of ants crawling across the land, following her trail and waiting for the moment she became tired and fell to the ground. Petrifying. What's more is that for some reason they had begun to emit smoke as if they were burning, and the more ants there were the more smoke there was, creating a horrific scene that she would not soon forget. Flying above had been scary and difficult, but it had been a haven compared to what had been going on below. Fortunately, she didn't have to experience it. But not everyone had been that lucky. There had been innocent bystanders that she had flown past in her quest to escape, and she was pretty sure that every land creature that had been caught up in the path of the ant army were dead. There was no hope for survival. And all this because she had refused Iocarig. It didn't make sense to her. Why had they pursued her so crazily? She could understand the appeal of a new unique ant queen, but did they have to go that far? They had kicked up a fuss across half of a major continent just because of that? How had they even communicated with each other to start such a thing? Nothing made sense. In fact, the only reason she had escaped is because she would eventually cross into the territory of the humans. If not for that, she would have eventually fallen into the waiting mandibles of the ant army. She probably wouldn't have been killed considering their goal, but with the way they had been acting, you would have never believed it. Perhaps she had hurt their pride by running away for so long, and some way along the line, their goal had switched from capture to extermination. You never know. Anyways, the land of the humans. Haha. It was actually in this place that she would experience the greatest fright of her life. Come to think of it, she should have known it when the ants stopped chasing her, that whatever territory she had stumbled in was bound to be equally or even more dangerous. However, anxiety and relief at escaping what had been her worst nightmare had left content at just being safe. So she delved deeper into the territory with her mission at the back of her mind and thoughts of exiting the continent at the forefront. As such, in her disheveled state of mind, she continued to travel through the sceneries without taking any consideration for things she should have been searching for, like powerful auras or just about anything that would signify a gathering of powerful individuals. As a matter of fact, she had been subconsciously avoiding those various auras as if she was a thief trying to evade attention. It was mainly inferior races like the rats that scurried around like that, fearful of pretty much every other life form because of their inherent weakness, but with thoughts of the blazing ant super colony occupying her brain she had found herself acting the same way. How funny it was that it was the threat of creatures that were supposed to be even weaker than rats that put her in the same position of terror. Regardless, it was because of this absent-minded behavior that she had found herself dumbfounded and without a plan when she was abruptly surrounded by a group of humans. Naturally, she hadn't feared them, initially. She had been more preoccupied with the notion that whoever owned those humans was probably sending them to request her presence. She hadn't found any humans in the other half of the continent, the one belonging to the ants, so she couldn't say for sure that this continent practiced the same act of human slavery as her own, but it was a reasonable assumption. Humans were very versatile, and most intelligent races would make use of them if they could. However, it didn't take long for her to detect the oppressive vibe of a powerful aura, and it belonged to those 12 humans. 4 of them were in the middle stages of the third realm, insignificant strength but unprecedented nonetheless for a human. 6 of them were in the upper stages of the third realm, respectable, but the remaining 2. The female had been in the first stage of the fourth realm, the same as her. However, the male had been in the second stage. As anyone would guess, she had been shocked silly. So much so that she had practically frozen, unable to make a single remark. And she had still been reeling with said shock when the male who was the strongest of them all abruptly asked. "Who is your master?" Master. In her addled mental state, she remembered thinking that the human had somehow been referring to her relationship with Gaia. She wouldn't exactly call Gaia her master, considering that she had free will to do anything she wished with her only obligation being to take up missions every now and then, but although she wasn't a slave, Gaia was not somebody she could disobey either. So a few people, especially those who had a problem with her, would call Gaia her master, to slight her. So it felt a little surreal to hear the human ask, "Who is your master?" It certainly hadn't helped her come back to her senses. As a result, she had carelessly responded that she did not have a master, and then tried to lift off into the air to fly away. Needless to say, she did not want to confront a set of bizarre humans that had somehow reached the fourth realm, especially when they seemed so confident. Even a fool would be able to tell that something was off, let alone her who had just been fleeing from ants, who also shouldn't have been this strong. She did not know how they were that strong, or how she had been unable to detect them until they had surrounded her, but she hadn't been interested in finding out. She wanted to leave. Alas, trying to flee had been the wrong move and things took a turn for the worse. One of them shouted, "I knew it. This is a never-seen-before beast and she's trying to escape. She doesn't have a master. Catch her." It was the female fourth realmer. They all began to do something with their mana, and in the next moment, they were all holding on to various weapons made of the elements. She was quite familiar with the elves, so she knew what weapons were, and she was even privy to the somewhat secret knowledge that the elves could imbue their various wooden or rock constructs with their own mana to make it more powerful. This mostly resulted in the construct shining with a colored glow that corresponded with the elf's element, and it was mightily impressive. But this was much different. They were not objects that were boosted by mana. No, they were literally the elements themselves, but shaped like weapons. The fourth realm man held a large sword made of flames, and the woman had something that looked like a pitch-black vaporous spear, but instead of a blade at the tip, it instead had 2 thick and slightly curved blades on the sides, at the end of the pole. Bellatrix would later learn that the design of the weapon was called a double-sided long axe, and that the odd darkness of the weapon was literally the darkness element, something that was even rarer than the opposing light element. But at the time of this grand display, she hadn't been in the right state of mind to admire the grand phenomenon that was the creation of these weapons, and instead the sight had only caused her to be more worried as she flapped her wings harder. Unfortunately, she would very soon find out that even if her mind was as sharp as it usually was, when it came to facing these humans in this kind of setting, there was nothing she could do. Thinking that she was safe from the deadly but short-ranged weapons, she had let her guard down, and of course, that had been a mistake. Before she knew it, all sorts of half-moon-shaped projectiles amongst other shapes slammed into her body. Most of them did no damage, but a few of them, especially the 2 that no doubt belonged to the fourth realmers, caused excruciating pain. The pain, coupled with the suddenness of it, shocked her so badly that she lost control of her body and fell back to the ground. She didn't even know that she was falling until it was too late to save herself, because of how addled her mind had been. Slamming into the ground had certainly woken her up, but with multiple bones broken all over her body, she was in a more pitiful state than ever before. Her heavy weight, coupled with the unyieldingness of the land, had joined together to work against her. That's why it was oftentimes dangerous to fly for larger species to fly if they weren't sufficiently proficient in it. The humans certainly didn't waste any time in capitalizing on her plight, and they converged towards her body like flies to a corpse. Then once again out of nowhere, they each started forming strange constructs out of their respective elements. However, this time, the strange shapes were long and flexible, lacking the deadly sharpness or weighty bluntness of a real weapon. Later she would find out that they called it the subduing rope. Each of them wrapped their own subduing rope around her, and that completely sealed her fate. When she regained her bearings and tried to break out, the oppressive feeling of restriction didn't budge in the slightest. What was weirder was that even the third realm's subduing ropes didn't relent. She could only guess that somehow, the subduing ropes were borrowing strength from the others, becoming more powerful themselves and displaying an insane show of genius that she couldn't begin to comprehend. She was completely and utterly trapped. The most humiliating thing had been when they had started ignoring her to talk amongst themselves, referring to her as a beast in a way that made her seem like she was something lower or weaker. Which was obviously sheer foolishness. The word dumb beast had been mentioned a few times, and that had only increased her spite. But amongst her increasing spite was her increasing fear. These humans were too strange. They could form weird constructs and render her into a position where she was unable to resist in just a few moves. Who knows what else they could do and what they had planned for her. Eventually, they returned their attention to her, and she remembered tensing up, thinking about all the bad things that could happen to her. Clearly they had an agenda in subduing her like that, and she was very sure she would not like the reason. However, no attack came, and they didn't start dragging her off either like she expected. Instead, they all placed their hands on their respective subduing ropes, did something she could not comprehend, then all of a sudden everything went black. She had passed out. The next time she awoke, she was in a different location entirely. Obviously, she had been relocated. She was in what seemed to be a city. An actual city like the capital of the Elven Kingdom. It had the rows of buildings that were obviously homes, and perhaps other things like the so-called shops, but there were differences too. One could say that the city was in part more advanced than the Elven one and another part less advanced. There were things that she could see that didn't make any sense to her, and there were things missing here that were present in the Elven capital. But before she could be given a chance to ponder on what she was looking at, a sudden shout caught her attention. All hail the Empress of Glorious Light. We greet the Empress of Glorious Light. Hail the Empress of Glorious Light. Hailing? She had seen that before. But it was something that had started in true dragon territory and spread outwards. Hail the goddess, hail the king, stuff like that. It worked similarly to praise thee and praise that, but a bit different. She had been slightly surprised to see the niche culture in a foreign continent. Nevertheless, that information didn't mean much, and she spread out her spirit sense to detect just who they were calling Empress, followed by lifting up her head so that she could see with her eyes too. She would never, ever forget the day that she met her. Beauty personified. The woman had pale unblemished skin, hair and eyes forged from light as if she were a law beast, perfect feminine curves that beckoned the eyes, a regal and invincible demeanor that looked down on all life, but most importantly, a devastating aura of might that she could not in the slightest bit read. When the differences in strength were too great, it became impossible for the weaker side to accurately guess the cultivation level of the stronger side. Between the two of them, Bellatrix was definitely the weaker side. Humans like this exist? Bellatrix remembered thinking that thought very vividly, word for word at that. After all, it was at that moment that her views on humans completely warped. The woman before her was a human, and yet she possessed profound power of the like she had never seen before. Sure, she had seen auras that rivaled this, but nothing that had a nature like this. To some extent, she even seemed to rival Gaia. What kind of concept was that? A human rivaling a god, even if it was a fallen one? Madness. Confronted with such irregular majesty, how could she not despair? She tried to speak, to make use of her charm so that she could do anything that would increase her chances of safety, but she couldn't. It wasn't the subduing ropes or anything like that. No. That wasn't needed. The fear that was thoroughly clenching both her throat and her heart was more than enough. The woman had eventually reached her front, but she didn't say anything for a while. In fact, she actually tilted her head to the side as if she were examining something interesting. It was a surprisingly adorable action. However, one look into those twin orbs of light was enough to snuff out the spontaneous thought. those eyes were not normal. She had seen all kinds of impressive eyes that had been affected by magic of some kind. It was uncommon, rare even, but nothing much more than that. In general, the only thing they guaranteed was a high affinity with a particular element, nothing else. Actually no. There was an exception, which was of course Yorma's third eye, but something like that could not be placed in the same category as the others. She had once been told by Titania that the eye wasn't something that had been gained from evolution or mutation and was instead a magical treasure that Yorma found called the Eye of Petrification. But that was all besides the point. This woman's eyes weren't frightening because of their magical nature. Rather, it was something else that she couldn't put into words. All she knew was that she felt in front of that woman, there was nothing that could be hidden. All her secrets were free for the taking if the woman simply wished it. It was a harrowing thought. It sounded silly now that she thought back on it now, but it hadn't been back then. Not one bit. Actually, the thought of those eyes could still give her jitters. In any case, after that the woman had softly raised her palm and all the cries hailing her name came to a stop. "Who and what are you?" the woman said. Her voice had been gentle. Elegant like many of the great people she knew, but there hadn't appeared to be any of the same steel in her voice. However, the loyalty and utter submission in the people around her spoke for itself. The woman had the greatest power here and didn't need to sound like it. But make no mistake, when Bellatrix said the voice sounded gentle, she did not mean that it sounded caring or motherly. No. She meant gentle in the way that she released the words. Soft-spoken, so to speak. The kind of voice someone might have used if they were muttering to themselves whilst in deep thought. Bellatrix didn't try to hide anything. She stated her name and race and where she came from. She even took the liberty to explain about the situation of envy. Well, it hadn't been her plan to reveal so much when she opened her mouth, but the words just kept coming out. It was the first time she had felt that talking could be so difficult. She could never regain control of her breathing, and the longer she stared into the woman's eyes, the more she panicked. It had felt like they were expanding into two burning suns, and try as she might, she could not look away. As a result, her explanation had been extremely haggard and by the end of it, she had been visibly shaking. The greatest humiliation of her life. The woman, and everyone else for that matter, had been completely silent during her explanation, not even asking questions. Only when she had nothing more to say did the woman finally speak. "Bellatrix. You bring valuable information to our home and should not have been treated like this. You people, free her." The same people who subdued her walked to her and placed their hands on their respective magic ropes. Soon she was free, but nobody stood close enough to make sure she didn't try to flee. The group that released her walked back into the crowd without a second look. Those in the crowd didn't tense up at the new threat. Nobody cared. It was as if they thought there was not a single possibility of her escaping or even fighting. Humiliation. And yet, at that time, the only thing she could think of was that she had been pardoned. That she would not be killed. Escaping hadn't even been a thought. Greater humiliation. Everyone disperse. I would like to speak to our guest alone. The woman spoke. Yes, Empress. Everyone replied in unison, and they all left swiftly. Soon enough Bellatrix was alone with the Empress. My name is Gloria. The woman, Gloria, spoke. It would appear we have a lot to talk about. And they did. They had a very long conversation over a period of a few days, and she had been taken care of. She had even been granted knowledge on their culture and way of life. When she was not with Gloria, she was with the annoying woman with the darkness element, touring the streets of the city. Like this, she learned all sorts of things that were not present anywhere else. They enslaved beasts instead of the other way around, wielded powerful elemental weapons, organized magic plants in ways that made them proliferate faster and die less, and more. They were much different to the elves and humans that she knew of. The difference between them and humans were obvious, but even when compared to the elves, they still came out on top. They had half of a continent to themselves. And all of this was because of Gloria. The darkness girl liked to say that a lot. She couldn't count how many times she would hear the phrase, praise the Empress of glorious light, in just a single conversation, talk less of total. But still, it was impossible to not acknowledge the sheer potency that was the Empress. That woman was not normal at all. She was so intelligent that it was frightening. More than enough times she had been suspicious about whether she could read minds, because it had always seemed like it in their conversations. Nothing seemed to faze her, and everything that came out of Bellatrix's mouth seemed to fall into the all-encompassing boundary of Gloria's expectations. Even Titania could not compare to her if you did not take into consideration things like clothing and the like. Eventually, with such thoughts running through her mind, she could no longer resist talking about the humans that she knew of along with the elves and fae.